They say a house tells you when it's been betrayed, the way a clock stops in the middle of the night, the way the kettle whistles at a wrong pitch, the way dust settles in a place where hands have been. Mine told me with a snap, the small, sensible things out of place. A photograph turned face down on the mantel, the drawer of my old desk left open, the bourbon bottle on the kitchen counter with a sliver missing even though I remembered finishing the glass that night. It was raining the evening of the break-in. A steady, polite rain you could lean on, not the kind that screams and batters. I woke to blue and red strobing through the bedroom blinds and the smell of someone else's cologne on my armchair. The police were careful. People are careful when they want to be polite about violence. But they asked the questions they always ask as if questions were bandages. When did you last see the safe, sir? Can you think of anyone who might have a grudge against you? Did anything else go missing? The safe was lighter. The safe, tucked under years of tax returns and a faded photograph of my daughter when she was 8, had been opened and rifled. 2 things were gone: cash I keep for emergencies and a small envelope containing a ledger, names, dates, figures. Not the sort of thing most thieves would value. Not the sort that makes the grin of coincidence easy to believe. You sure it wasn't a professional? The detective asked, soft and flat. No forced entry. That sometimes means they had a key. I was 56 that year. My hands are marked with the thin scars of a life that hasn't been afraid of work, weeding, tightening a bad screw, a belt that had once held a hammer. I think that's why it smarted. A house is part flesh in its way. When someone takes from it, they take from the narrative you tell yourself about safety and decency. In the days after, friends brought casseroles and condolences. My daughter, Hannah, cried as if the hurt were all for her. She lives close enough I can hear her laugh through the thin summer nights some windows away. She has never liked to be alone for long. She comforts the world the way some people smoke, with a small, fidgeting ritual. Her husband, my son-in-law, Miles, held my hand with a grin that never reached his eyes. He was helpful. He installed a new deadbolt. He brought over motion sensor lights with a flourish. He set up a camera that chirped whenever a car moved in the street. He said all the right things, the smooth sentences of a man glad to be useful. 2 weeks later came the things that made the police shift from sympathetic to curious. A post on Facebook, tasteful, a golden hour photograph, announced Miles had bought a used 2-story a few towns over. The house, a modest colonial with a 3-car garage and a lawn that would have made my father proud. The caption: start of something new. The picture had the kind of filter you use when you want people to look and not pry. My eyebrows nodded. Miles works at the dealership. He's good with cars, knows how to read a buyer. But I knew how car salesmen ate, on thin profits and long hours, and I also knew that in the ledger missing from my safe there were entries that suggested a rhythm to small, repeated payments, hush sums here and there, amounts that didn't belong to ordinary family favors. The ledger was not mine to begin with. It belonged to a client I used to help with odd jobs, a man who dealt in antiques and, on the side, small consignments that sometimes ended up in the wrong hands. I had kept his notes once, years ago, intending to help him straighten things out. I had not imagined anyone would come for them. Then came the car. Miles posted that, too, a photograph of a gleaming sedan, the sun slanting on its hood, captioned with an emoji and the words, "Put in the work." He had changed his clothes, swapped scruffy afternoons for outfits that fit like promises. He came to Sunday dinner the week after with his new keys on a chain, and a laugh that didn't sit right with me. He talked about contractors and closing dates the way men used to talk about war plans, crisp, mechanical, without apology. There is a particular kind of silence that comes from watching a person accept what you once thought only fate could grant them. It feels less like envy and more like a recalibration of the world's moral arithmetic. My daughter, bless her, glowed with pride. She deserved the good things. I wanted to tell her the truth and knew I would sound like a jealous old fool. I told myself I was being ridiculous. But old men learn to listen to ridiculousness. Ridiculousness is often the nose hair that detects the fire. I started small. I reviewed the police report. I checked the camera footage Miles had insisted we install after the burglary, not in the hope of seeing a masked figure but to be thorough. The footage showed the street at 2 in the morning, a delivery van, then nothing, then a shadow moving like a cautious animal. The driveway lights were out when the van pulled up. The van left before dawn, its license plate blurred from the angle. The detective promised to follow up. He smiled with the bland professionalism of someone who has learned to hope and then be disappointed. That night I emptied the drawers I had left undisturbed for years. I sat at my kitchen table with a lamp and the ledger's blank spot gnawing at me like a toothache. My hands folded and refolded the photograph of Hannah at 8. The numbers in my head began to line up like soldiers, small payments, a used car, a down payment on a house, the night the safe was lighter. Cold justice is not a poem. It does not announce itself with trumpets. It is arithmetic, clean sums, accounted for and returned. You learn this if you have ever balanced a checkbook at midnight, while the house sleeps and your doubts petter out like cats at the foot of your bed. You learn to make lists. You learn to watch. So I began to watch. Not like a rash man with a rifle in the rafters, but like someone cataloging the weather. Where did Miles get his work? Which names did he casually mention? Who were the contractors at the new property? Who pulled up late at night and left before dawn? I took a photograph of the sedan when he parked outside my daughter's on a Sunday and saved it. I wrote down license plate fragments. I called the dealership and asked for records, not because I expected compliance but because the act of asking is sometimes a probe, and probes can ripple. On the surface I kept my customary life. I mowed the lawn, I fixed the faucet in the guest bathroom that had been dripping since spring, I bought Hannah a bouquet of peonies and made a show of forgetting to add my name to the card. People saw what they wanted to see, a man reconciled to misfortune, recovering with quiet dignity. They did not notice the ledger I imagined, or the way my eyes tracked Miles when he entered a room. A week after the house purchase, I stood on my porch and watched Miles back his new sedan down the street, headlights slanting through the drizzle. He waved at Hannah, then at me, that little, practiced wave that says I'm part of the family now. He had what he wanted. For now, he wore his success like a badge. I poured a drink, neat, and turned the glass in my hand until the bourbon caught the light. Cold justice is patient, I thought. It has the virtue of being precise. It does not rush. It does not need to shout. It waits until the numbers add up, then it balances the books. The ledger had names. Names could be followed. Names could be coaxed into telling where money had gone, and sometimes, where it had come from. The safe had been rifled for a reason. Somebody wanted those names out of circulation. A week later, something else happened that made me put down my glass and straighten the photograph on the mantel. The mailman brought a letter addressed to Miles at the new house, an invitation to a closing party, stamped in gold, the sort of thing people send when they want the world to applaud them. The envelope smelled faintly of expensive paper. I read it twice. The second time, I did not see party paraphernalia. I saw a date. I saw an address. I saw an opportunity. A week after that golden invitation landed in my mailbox, I sat in my truck outside Miles's new place and watched him christen his kingdom. The house stood on the corner of a clean, newborn subdivision, one of those neighborhoods where even the trees look rehearsed. Fresh sod rolled out like a green carpet, driveways still tattooed with chalk marks from the contractors. Miles had hung a flag by the porch. My daughter's laugh fluttered in the wind like a sound I didn't own anymore. The party itself was small, tasteful. The grill hissed. A Bluetooth speaker pumped out old country songs with just enough nostalgia to keep everyone polite. Miles moved among them like a salesman on parade, hand on shoulder, voice warm and practiced. "We're blessed," he kept saying. "God's been good." I stood by the fence with my paper plate and nodded in all the right places. I even let him tell the story of how he'd worked hard for all this. Everyone loves a myth, and he told his like scripture. But when he opened the trunk of that sleek sedan to show off a new set of tools, top of the line, man, pure steel, I noticed the label, Rendell and Company. The name hit me like a cough I'd been holding. Rendell wasn't a hardware brand. It was a family name from the ledger. I let the conversation flow over me, nodding, smiling, cataloging. I've always been good at pretending to be slow when I'm really thinking fast. My mind was already tracing connections, threading memory with motive. When the guests thinned and dusk crawled up the porch lights, I slipped inside under the excuse of looking for Hannah. The house smelled of new paint and ambition. Every wall had something Miles wanted to be seen: certificates, photos, the car keys tossed just so. I opened the study door without knocking. Miles was there, alone, counting stacks of bills, neat, green, methodical. He didn't hear me right away. He was humming under his breath, that same song from the party, and the sight of it, the rhythm of theft turned to domestic peace, did something to me I can't quite name. It wasn't anger. Anger is loud and messy. This was quieter. The sort of stillness a sniper must feel when the crosshairs settle. When he finally noticed me, he flinched, then laughed too quickly. "Jesus, you scared me. Looking for Hannah?" "Just stretching my legs," I said. My eyes didn't leave the cash. He stacked it back into a small safe, the kind you buy at Walmart when you think security is a hobby. He spun the dial with the smug precision of someone who believes secrecy equals control. "You're doing well for yourself," I said. He smiled. "Yeah, well, I told you the dealership's been good to me lately. Commissions. Timing. Timing," I repeated. He clapped my shoulder. "You ever think maybe your luck rubs off, huh? There's a certain point when you realize the universe is not going to hand you justice. You'll have to dig it out yourself, fingernails and all." That was the moment. I left the party early, told Hannah I wasn't feeling well. On the way home, I drove the long route, past the old lot where my workshop used to be, past the sign for Rendell and Company. Salvage. The company had folded 3 years ago after its owner disappeared. What most people didn't know is that Rendell had used my client's antique business as a laundering front. That ledger in my stolen safe contained the only paper trail connecting Rendell's shell accounts to certain names. Names that could ruin people. And now, those same names were funding my son-in-law's dream house. At home, I opened the little notebook where I'd begun writing again, a poor man's copy of the lost ledger. I wrote down Rendell, underlined it twice, then Miles' house cash. The rest of the night I sat in my recliner, listening to the pipes tick and the rain whisper against the glass. The next morning, I paid a visit to an old friend, Detective Robert Steele, retired, whose name still opened a few back doors. He'd always said my generation was too trusting. When I told him about the robbery, the missing ledger, and Miles's sudden wealth, he didn't call me paranoid. He just sighed. "You think he found out what was in the safe?" he said. "I think he found it, and understood enough to sell pieces of it." Steele rubbed his jaw. "You know what happens if you go after family?" "Yes," I said. "It gets personal." He leaned back. "And if you're wrong?" "I'm not." Steele studied me. "Then you better be precise. Cold justice doesn't tolerate mistakes." He gave me a card with a number on the back. Someone who used to work cybercrime, could trace financial anomalies quietly. I thanked him, went home, and spent the afternoon pretending to prune my roses while watching Hannah's car pull into their driveway. She was smiling. That night, the Cyberman called back. "Your son-in-law's been moving small transfers, always under reporting thresholds. He's clean on paper, but the pattern's textbook laundering. He's using shell accounts tied to Rendell's old network. And sir, one of the accounts still bears your name, likely forged." I stared at the receiver until the line went silent. Then I poured myself a bourbon and watched the lights blink from the house across the way. My daughter's laughter drifted out of their window. Family. Blood and betrayal, two liquids that look the same until you taste them. The world outside felt very still. I turned the glass in my hand, felt the condensation cool my fingertips, and whispered to the quiet. "All right then, Miles. Let's balance the books. Revenge isn't a sprint, It's bookkeeping. You don't get your satisfaction from rage, you get it from precision. The next morning, I made coffee strong enough to burn through the fog in my head, sat at the kitchen table, and drew a diagram. In the center, Miles. Around him, a halo of question marks: Rendell's network, shell accounts, cash flow, possible partners. Every arrow was a possibility. Every possibility a way to bring him down without leaving a fingerprint. I wasn't going to the police again. The law is good at cleaning up messes after the fire's out, not at understanding who lit it. I'd learned that after the first robbery, when the officer took my statement and handed me sympathy like a receipt. So I went to work my way, quiet, patient, deliberate. Miles was a creature of habit. He left the house at 8:15 sharp, coffee in a stainless steel tumbler, tie loose, car radio humming the same morning talk show. I followed twice that week, once in the truck, once on foot from a distance. He drove past the dealership most mornings before doubling back 20 minutes later. That detail was small, but it meant something. Nobody circles their workplace unless they're meeting someone they don't want the cameras to see. On the third morning, I parked in a diner lot across the street and waited. He pulled up behind an abandoned gas station, same spot, same time. A gray van rolled in from the opposite side. The same model that had parked outside my house the night of the robbery. My heart didn't race, it narrowed. The men talked through the window. Then Miles handed over a small black case. The van driver flipped it open, nodded, gave him a brown envelope. They shook hands, like gentlemen exchanging a handshake at a funeral. Then they left in opposite directions. I sipped my coffee, memorizing the van's partial plate, 9BK. 12. That night I called Steele. "Can you still run a plate? You planning to tell me why?" he asked. "I'm planning to tell you after." He grunted. "You never change." While he worked his quiet magic, I set about constructing my own trap. Justice is best when the guilty deliver it to themselves. I started by feeding Miles a rumor. A friend at the old antique circuit still owed me a favor, so I had him mention, loudly, where gossip travels fast, that Rendell's old records were resurfacing. A collector bought some of the missing ledgers. My friend said at a pawn meet, and he's looking to sell the info to clear the books. By the end of that week, I got my confirmation. Miles showed up at my door, pretending to drop off a bottle of wine for Hannah's birthday. He never brought wine. He's more of a six-pack man. He smiled too much, eyes darting to my study. "Heard anything new about the break-in?" "Nothing useful," I said. "Cops think it was random." He nodded. "Shame. You know, funny thing, someone at work mentioned a guy selling old business ledgers. I thought of you." I looked him dead in the eye. "Can't imagine why." He laughed too quickly, changed the subject, left within 5 minutes. That night, the motion sensor camera on my porch blinked. He'd come back. He didn't realize the new system I'd installed, an old trick from Steele, recorded to a separate hidden drive. The next morning, I watched him on my laptop, Miles picking the back lock with the ease of a man who'd done it before, heading straight for my study. He searched the desk drawers, the cabinet, then the wall safe I'd left slightly ajar, bait. Inside were papers that looked official, photocopies of ledger entries, old account numbers, a name or two he'd recognize. He took them. I let him. By the weekend, Steele called with the plate info. The van belonged to a salvage contractor once on Rendell's payroll. The driver's name, Paul Henley, record of petty fraud, fired months before Rendell's disappearance. I asked Steele to let it rest. I wanted to handle this one without a badge nearby. Through the week, Miles grew bolder. I could see it in the way he carried himself at dinner, in the way he called me, Dad, with a tone that was all performance. My daughter didn't notice, she was too happy. The new house, the cars, the trips he suddenly could afford, she thought she'd married up in the world. And I let her think so. For now. Then, one night, he made a mistake. He got drunk and bragged to a friend at a bar, a man who'd once done side work for Rendell, that The old man doesn't know half of what he's sitting on. The friend texted me the next morning. I slipped him 100 for his trouble. I had what I needed: motive, proof, and a thief who'd started to believe he was untouchable. The final step of the investigation wasn't about gathering evidence anymore. It was about framing the truth so that it couldn't be ignored or denied. I made copies of the camera footage, the bank statements from Steele's contact, and my own forged ledger pages, all pointing back to Miles as the conduit for Rendell's missing money. Then I printed one more thing, a single sheet that read, in bold, "Rendell's ghost doesn't forget debts." I sealed everything in an envelope and slipped it into the mailbox at Miles's dealership, addressed simply, "To the owner. Confidential." 2 days later, the dealership manager called an emergency staff meeting. Rumor had it someone was under investigation for financial misconduct. By Friday, Miles came to see me again, pale, sweating. "Someone's spreading lies about me," he said. "I think it's about those old accounts. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" I stirred my coffee slowly. "Why would I?" He leaned forward, voice cracking. "Because they mentioned your name." "Did they now?" I said, smiling without warmth. "Then maybe you should ask yourself why." His eyes darted around the room, searching for something that wasn't there. Innocence, maybe. That was the moment I saw it, the first crack in his confidence. The numbers were starting to balance. There's a moment in every careful plan when you stop cataloging and start acting. For a long while I had stayed on the safe side of the line, watching, listening, collecting data. Then I realized the ledger's absence wasn't just a theft, it was a ledger of promises traded for silence. My ledger had names that could ruin a man, but so did my silence. I had to choose which ledger I wanted to keep, the one that recorded my life as an honest man, or the one that would record the truth. I chose the truth. Cold justice is arithmetic, but it sometimes requires a small lie to balance the equation. I'm not proud of that. Pride is a luxury for men who haven't had to balance a lifetime of small humiliations. I needed to push Miles into a situation where the truth about him would be unavoidable, where his new house, his shiny car, his jokes at Sunday dinner would be revealed as what they were, purchased with someone else's credit. First, containment. If you want to break a man, don't go for the face, go for the stage where he performs. Miles loved his stage, the dealership, the neighborhood, the family dinner. I had to make sure his stage was visible and his props fragile. I began by tightening the net around his finances. Steele's contact had given me a footprint, transfers that hopped through shell accounts timed to avoid bank flags. I hired the Cyberman for 3 days more than I'd told Steele, asking for deeper traces, IP logs, timestamps, who initiated the transfers. We found enough to tie several deposits back to a cluster of accounts that had once answered to Rendell and Company. The Cyberman printed the timeline and sent it overnight in a sealed envelope to an attorney I'd met through the Veterans Group. The attorney read it, smiled with the kind of professional satisfaction reserved for people who like making crooked things straight, and agreed to draft a simple civil inquiry, subpoenas to the dealership's finance office and to the shell companies. A subpoena is not a weapon a man like Miles expects his father-in-law to unleash. It is a legal tap on the shoulder. But subpoenas carry weight. When you file them through an attorney, they sound like thunder in a small, talkative town. Second, provocation. I needed Miles to make a mistake publicly. There's comfort in vanity, and vanity is an engine of error. I started dropping carefully constructed hints, anonymous notes to the dealership manager about suspicious deposit patterns, a whispered rumor to a contractor that Miles had paid in cash for materials that never arrived for Rendell's old customers. Rumor does the work the law sometimes cannot. It loosens the tongue of men who think they're above suspicion. Within days, Miles's name was in closed conversations. He began to look over his shoulder. Third, show and tell. I put together the things I had, the camera footage of him rifling my study, the copied pseudoledger with the forged account numbers he'd stolen from my bait, the cyber timeline tying small deposits to Rendell's cluster. I knew a private showing would do nothing, this needed to leak, but in a way that left fingerprints clean. So I assembled a packet and sent it to 3 places at once: the dealership owner, anonymous but traceable through legal channels, a local reporter who wrote community business columns, and the attorney who had the subpoena. The packet was factual and cold: dates, transfers, photographs. No accusations that couldn't be sourced. The kind of thing that makes men tidy up their lives very quickly. That night, Miles came by furious. He banged on my door like a man who thinks violence can replace consequence. Hannah stood behind him, bewildered, clutching her cardigan. "What are you playing at?" he spat, voice a cracked bell. "You sent something. You're ruining me." I let him rage. Anger tells a lot about a man. I poured a bourbon for myself and offered Hannah nothing but calm. "Look at me, Miles," I said when he paused for breath. "You chose to do something. You chose to take things that weren't yours. You chose to let your greed outpace your caution." He stepped forward as if to strike, then thought better of it. He's not a small man, but he's not a brave one when corners close. He fled like a guilty animal. Hannah clung to me afterward and sobbed into my shoulder. She couldn't reconcile the man she loved with the evidence I'd put at the center of the table. I would not say it does not hurt to watch the person you love be hurt by truth. Truth is a blade that sometimes cuts both hands. The next morning the dealership called. The owner asked for an emergency meeting. Miles was suspended pending an internal audit. The neighborhood group chat lit up with speculation. A small local paper called and asked if I'd confirm a few dates. I lied politely, claiming ignorance. The law's machinery creaked into life. Phone calls, forms, the slow shuffle of paperwork that started to choke the oxygen out of Miles's new life. But there was more to be done. I had to ensure the ledger, or at least the memory of the ledger, surfaced in a place that would make Miles's connections undeniable. So I created a second, controlled unveiling. I arranged for Paul Henley, the salvage contractor with the faded criminal record, to discover an old trunk while clearing a property once owned by Rendell. Paul had his pride, but he liked a quick buck more. I paid him to find the trunk and, crucially, to bring a neutral witness, a retired appraiser who still wrote for the paper. The trunk contained relics, receipts, a few small items that could be linked to known customers, and copies of documents that bore the hallmarks of the stolen ledger. When the appraiser published a short column about the turn of events, "Old records found, questions follow," it wasn't dramatic. It was a slow, steady drip that soaked everything. People began to place names. People began to murmur about Rendell again, and that whisper carried Miles's name like a match to kindling. There was one decision I wrestled with more than the others: whether to involve the police with a formal complaint naming Miles. To make the fall complete, I needed law and social consequence to converge. The police are clumsy instruments. They make mistakes and they make enemies. But left to himself, Miles might launder evidence away. I sat with Steele over coffee and told him everything I had. He listened, silent and precise, like a man who'd seen too many families collapse under quieter sins. "If you want this to stick," he said finally, "we do it the right way. We give them the paper trail and let the system do what it does. But you need to be prepared for what happens after. Your daughter will know, and she may not forgive you for dragging it into the light." I had rehearsed that fear. I had counted it like an expense. I had decided the cost was worth the ledger's name. In the ledger's absence, other things were being bought: a house, a facade of Providence, a family's future built on stolen credit. I could not live with that without feeling complicit. So I signed a statement. I read it 3 times, corrected the commas that made the sentence read like a confession, and handed it to Steele. My handwriting has always been plain. It shows no flourish. The police took it and promised discretion, then said things they always say to calm old men who want restitution. "We'll look into it. We'll follow the trail." And there it was, the moment I had both dreaded and planned for. The official machinery started to turn. There is no grandeur in this. Only the low, steady work of making a life balance sheet line up. I had crossed the line not with a gun or a shout, but with filings and whispers and a trunk of paper. The thing about crossing that line is you cannot then step back. You are committed. You have to see the ledger closed, the books balanced, no matter how many hearts get bruised in the process. When I locked my front door that evening, Hannah's car was in the drive. She was home, but not safe in the way she had been. I poured another bourbon and watched the steam in my cup. Cold justice moves like ice. It takes time to form, and then it fractures everything it touches. The storm came quietly at first. Not a thunderclap or a siren, just the hollow rhythm of things beginning to break. The dealership froze. Miles's accounts pending. Internal review? Clients he used to boast about stopped returning calls. Hannah's smile, once automatic, began to tremble at the corners. That's how retribution begins, with small silences, not grand gestures. By midweek, the story about Rendell's trunk hit the regional news. Only a short segment. Possible links to financial irregularities under investigation. No names, no photos. But in a town like ours, anonymity is a paper door. People can see through it even when it's closed. I spent those days pretending to live the same old life. Morning walks, trimming the hedge, slow conversations at the hardware store. Inside, though, I was tightening the screws. One night, around 9, Steele called. They pulled surveillance from the dealership office. Your son-in-law's signature's on 2 accounts tied to the shell companies. We're building the chain. How long until it's official? A week, maybe less. I thanked him, though gratitude felt misplaced. Justice isn't a favor, it's a debt collected late. After the call, I went out to the porch. Across the street, Hannah's windows were lit. 2 silhouettes, hers and Miles's, arguing in that body language only long relationships know, one pleading, one defensive, one tired. He paced. She held her head. Then the lights went out, the way a stage does when the scene ends. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt the faint ache of something old and human, pity maybe. But pity is the currency that buys injustice. I let it expire. The next morning, Miles showed up at my door. No preamble. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him, shirt wrinkled, eyes bloodshot, sweat clinging to his temples. You did this, he said, voice hoarse. You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know what you've done. I opened the door wider. Then enlighten me. He stepped forward unsteady. They're investigating not just me, they're reopening Rendell's case. People are nervous. Dangerous people. You have no idea what's at stake. Then maybe you shouldn't have borrowed from them. I said. You think I had a choice? He laughed hollow. You think this town runs on honesty? Rendell's books didn't die with him, they were insurance. I just took what he owed me. There it was, his confession, wrapped in justification. Greed always dresses like victimhood. Insurance, I repeated. Funny. You robbed my safe to collect your payout. He froze. His lips moved but no words came. Then he turned, storming off into the street. I closed the door slowly. Inside, my house felt still, too still. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't over. Men like Miles don't crumble quietly. They strike back before the fall. That night, I laid the groundwork for the final act. I printed every file I had, the transfers, the camera footage, even copies of the subpoena, and stored them in a fireproof box under the floorboard of my workshop. Then I made one last copy, tucked it into an envelope marked, to be opened in case of my death, and drove it to Steele's mailbox. Paranoia is just prudence with good memory. Next, I arranged a small insurance of my own. I called Paul Henley, the van driver. Offered him $5,000 to meet me at a diner. He came, jittery but eager. You ever wonder what happened to Rendell? I asked. Everybody wonders, he said. Word is he skipped town. Others say he's fertilizer under a new highway. Let's say, I told him. Someone wanted proof that he didn't just vanish, that he was silenced. He leaned forward. You got proof? Maybe. But I'd need someone who remembers that night. Someone who drove a van. His eyes darted to the window, then back to me. You trying to pin something on me? Quite the opposite, I said. I'm offering you protection. There's a man connecting you to the wrong side of that ledger. His name's Miles. Paul went pale. He's been calling me. Told me to stay quiet. Then don't. I slid him a prepaid phone. If he contacts you again, record it. Keep him talking. By the time I left, Paul's hands were shaking, but he had that look men get when survival suddenly feels possible. 2 days later, he called. I got him, he whispered. He said Rendell was handled and that he'd keep paying me to forget. I told him to keep the recording safe. Steele would know what to do with it when the time came. That was the last piece I needed. Now the case wasn't just theft, it was implication in something darker. The kind of stain that doesn't wash out with a PR statement. I went home, poured a bourbon, and opened the blinds. Miles's house was dark again. Hannah's car was gone. The stage was empty. Justice had momentum now. It didn't need my push anymore. It was rolling downhill on its own. Still, I couldn't sleep. Somewhere between the ticking of the clock and the hum of the fridge, I realized I wasn't planning just an exposure anymore. I was planning a reckoning. And reckonings, once started, don't stop halfway. When a man starts drowning, he doesn't think about the ocean, he thinks about the surface. Miles was drowning. I could see it in his posture, in the way his shoulders curved inward, as if he were bracing for an invisible punch. His calls to Hannah grew short and frantic. His visits stopped altogether. He'd started living out of a motel off Highway 12, the kind of place that charges by the week and pretends not to notice who checks in at midnight. But desperation makes men inventive, and fear makes them stupid. The trap began, as traps do, with bait. I knew Miles would try to erase the evidence. Men like him always do, not out of courage, but panic. Steele's people had already confirmed the investigation was active. Miles's accounts were frozen, and the dealership had quietly terminated his position, pending legal review. He still had the car, though, and a handful of old contacts from Rendell's network. Those would be the veins I'd use to bleed him dry. That week, I called Paul Henley again. He'll reach out to you soon, I told him. Play along. Tell him you're being pressured by someone new, someone who claims to have Rendell's full ledger. Tell him the buyer wants to sell it back, for cash. Paul chuckled nervously. And if he bites? Then we give him what he's asking for. The ledger would be a decoy, a neat folder stuffed with copies of random old invoices, the kind that looked dangerous from a distance but proved meaningless on inspection. The plan was simple. Miles would think he was buying back his freedom, but he'd actually be stepping straight into the camera lens. 3 nights later, the line buzzed. Paul's voice was a whisper. He wants to meet. Says he's got 20 grand. He's panicked, man. Says people are following him. Where? Warehouse by the old rail yard. Midnight tomorrow. Perfect. Isolated. Quiet. I spent that afternoon setting the pieces. Steele, still technically retired, arranged for a pair of his old contacts to sit in a car across the street, unofficial surveillance, just in case the situation went sideways. I told them nothing about my personal reasons. Just that a man might try to destroy evidence related to Rendell. That was enough for them. At 10 I drove down there myself. I didn't plan to interfere. I only wanted to witness the arithmetic complete itself. The warehouse was a skeleton, rusted girders, concrete bones, a roof that moaned with every gust of wind. I parked 2 blocks away and watched through binoculars. At exactly midnight, Miles's sedan rolled in, headlights off. He stepped out clutching a briefcase. His movements were jittery, unpracticed, the body language of someone pretending to be brave. 5 minutes later, Paul arrived in the van. He got out slowly, holding the decoy folder. The 2 men met halfway between the cars. The scene had a strange symmetry, the predator and his accomplice, both unsure who was who. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the rhythm. Miles barked questions. Paul gestured to the folder. They argued, stepped closer, voices rising. Then Miles shoved the case at him. Paul didn't take it. Instead, he pointed toward the shadows where the cameras were hidden. Miles turned his head, just for a second, and saw the flash of a lens under the sodium light. He froze. Then he lunged. What happened next was quick and ugly. Miles snatched the folder, swung the briefcase, and struck Paul across the face. Paper scattered into the night like frightened birds. He shouted something I couldn't catch, then bolted toward his car. The observers moved in, headlights flaring. Miles panicked, dropped the folder, jumped into the sedan, and slammed into reverse. He hit a barrel, skidded, and the car's rear wheel sank into a ditch. He was shouting, flailing, trapped half in, half out of the door when the unmarked car's blue lights finally came alive. I didn't need to see the rest. By morning, the story was everywhere. Local men arrested in connection with fraud and possible homicide. They'd connected him to Rendell's disappearance through the recorded call with Paul. His words about handling the man were enough to open an old case. The ledger might have been gone, but the ghost of it was alive and hungry. I spent that day in silence. Hannah came by in tears, clutching the newspaper. They say he killed someone, Dad. Tell me it's not true. I met her eyes. Sometimes people kill things long before the law catches up. She stared at me, searching for softness, and found none. You knew, she whispered. You've been behind this all along. I said nothing. A father's silence can be mercy or cruelty, depending on the angle of the light. She left without another word. That evening, Steele dropped by. It's done, he said, sitting heavily in the chair across from me. He confessed to the fraud. The Rendell angle's still under review, but it's enough to keep him locked up. Did Paul get clear? Untouched. He'll disappear for a while. We sat a long time without talking. The house was quiet, like it had been before all of this, but quieter in a way that made even the ticking of the clock sound guilty. Finally Steele said, You got what you wanted. I looked at the window. Rain had started again, slow, patient. No, I said. I got what I earned. He nodded once, the kind of nod you give a man who's both right and damned. Then he left me to my bourbon and the sound of the rain finishing what justice had started. The news didn't break all at once, it bled. First the rumor, then the headline, then the photos. Miles in handcuffs outside the precinct, eyes hollow, suit rumpled like he'd wrestled with his conscience and lost. The caption beneath read Local businessman arrested in connection with fraud and possible obstruction of justice in Rendell case. That was how my daughter found out. Not through me, not through a lawyer, but through a push notification on her phone while waiting in line at the grocery store. The milk in her cart soured faster than her expression. She didn't call for 2 days. When she did, her voice was somewhere between grief and disbelief. You knew, she said. Not a question. You knew this was coming, and you let it happen. I didn't let it happen, I said quietly. I made it happen. The silence that followed was long enough for me to hear the faint crackle of her breath. Then the click. I didn't expect forgiveness. That's not why people like me do things like this. We act because we can't not act, because the ledger in our chest demands balance. Still, her absence hurt in ways I hadn't rehearsed. The house returned to its old noises, the floorboards sighing, the kettle whistling a note too sharp, the porch light flickering like a bad conscience. For a few days, the reporters hovered, hungry for a quote. They knocked, they called, they left notes pretending to be questions. I gave them nothing. The quiet suited me better. The investigation consumed Miles whole. Every week brought a new layer of discovery: falsified contracts, shell accounts reaching back years, traces of Rendell's missing assets. The police found items in the trunk of Miles's sedan that matched Rendell's last known possessions: a ledger fragment, a set of keys, a gold lighter engraved with his initials. The lighter had a smear of blood under the hinge. They couldn't prove murder, not yet. But they could prove motive, means, and connection. And that was enough to turn suspicion into inevitability. Steele came by with updates, though he no longer wore the habit of a detective. "He's trying for a plea," he said, nursing coffee at my kitchen table. "Fraud, embezzlement, obstruction. He'll serve time even if the Rendell thing never sticks." "Good," I said. "You don't look satisfied. Justice isn't supposed to feel good." He smiled, sad and thin. "No, but it's supposed to stop hurting." He was wrong. Justice doesn't stop anything. It just changes the direction of the ache. About a week after the arrest, I found a note under my door. It was Hannah's handwriting, small and deliberate. "Dad, I need time. I can't look at you without seeing what you did to him, to us. Maybe you were right, but I can't live inside that kind of right now. H." I folded it carefully, placed it inside the drawer where I used to keep my will, and sat in the dark. A father's victory should never come at the cost of his child's faith, but the arithmetic was what it was. That night I dreamed of my old safe, the one that started it all. In the dream it was open, but instead of cash or ledgers, it held a mirror. When I looked inside, I saw no thief, no avenger, just a man who'd mistaken punishment for peace. Spring came reluctantly that year. The first blooms on the peonies I planted for Hannah opened pale, hesitant, as if unsure whether to trust the light. I tended them anyway. Justice, I'd learned, doesn't require joy, only discipline. Then, one afternoon, Steele showed up again. No preamble this time, just a file folder. "They found Rendell," he said. My hand paused over the teapot. "Found?" "His remains. Shallow grave near the quarry. Same Van Tire tracks as the one linked to your son-in-law's meeting with Henley. It's over." Over. The word had weight, but no warmth. "Henley?" I asked. "Cooperating witness. He'll vanish into witness protection once sentencing's done." I nodded. The arithmetic was complete. Every name crossed out, every sum balanced. The next morning, I visited the county jail. Hannah hadn't gone. I suppose she couldn't. The guard recognized my name and led me down a narrow hallway that smelled of disinfectant and regret. Miles sat behind the glass, thinner now, hair longer, eyes sunken but awake. He looked at me as if seeing a ghost. "You got what you wanted," he said. "I got the truth." He leaned forward, voice low. "Truth doesn't build houses. It burns them. Then maybe they were built wrong to begin with." He smiled, the first genuine thing I'd seen from him. "You know, Rendell used to say something like that. You two would have gotten along." "Rendell's dead," I said. He nodded. "And so am I." He didn't speak again. I left him there, behind the glass, in the echo of his own confession. When I came home, the porch light had finally burned out. I didn't replace it. Some lights don't deserve to stay on. I poured a bourbon, sat by the window, and listened to the town settle into night. Somewhere, a train passed, long, mournful, like a sigh through metal lungs. Miles was in custody. Rendell was accounted for. The ledger, real and imagined, was finally balanced. But Hannah's house stayed dark. That's the trouble with revenge dressed as justice. It pays every debt except the one you owe to the living. Time has a way of thinning both rage and righteousness until they look the same. The week after Miles's sentencing, the papers stopped calling it fraud and started calling it closure. People love closure, it fits neatly between advertisements. For me, there was nothing neat about it. Justice had been served, yes. The books were balanced, the names accounted for. Yet every morning I woke to the same silence, the kind that doesn't belong to peace but to absence. Hannah still hadn't spoken to me. I'd gotten used to hearing her voice and memories instead, her laughter through the kitchen doorway, her footsteps on the gravel when she came to visit. I could almost hear them now, but they stopped at the gate. Sometimes I'd catch sight of her car driving past without slowing. She didn't honk, didn't wave. The quiet between us was the real sentence, and I was the only one serving time for it. One evening, Steele came by again. He'd aged more in the last year than I had in 5. We sat on the porch, the way we used to before everything went wrong. You know, he said, they offered Miles a deal. Lesser charge if he names who else was involved with Rendell. Did he take it? Not yet. Word is, he doesn't think anyone would believe him. I nodded. Because no one does. Steele studied me. He told his lawyer one thing, though, said he never meant to steal from you. Said he was just retrieving something that already belonged to him. I laughed softly, though nothing about it was funny. A thief's logic. They always think justice owes them interest. He leaned back. You know what else he said? That he envied you. Said you were the only man he'd ever met who could destroy someone and sleep afterward. I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I hadn't slept. Not properly. Revenge doesn't end when the gavel drops. It lingers like a hum in your teeth you can't quite stop feeling. When Steele left, I stayed out there until the sky went from blue to iron gray. Then I poured a bourbon, the same ritual that had carried me through every long night, and realized it no longer tasted like comfort, just habit. A few days later, I found a letter in my mailbox. No name, no return address, just my own handwriting on the front. I didn't remember sending it. Inside was a single sentence. When you take from a thief, you inherit his silence. I didn't know if I'd written it in some late-night trance or if someone else was reminding me of what I already knew. Either way, it was true. The quiet had become part of me. Spring turned to summer. The town forgot about the case. News scandals came along, a mayor's cousin caught with bribes, a factory accident blamed on paperwork. People moved on. Only I stayed stuck in the amber of my own doing. One afternoon, I went to Hannah's house. I told myself it was to drop off some mail that had come here by mistake, but I knew it was really to see her face. She opened the door slowly, surprise flickering in her eyes before she masked it with exhaustion. Dad, she said flatly. Hannah, I answered, holding out the envelope. This came for you. She took it, glancing at the handwriting. That's Mom's cousin's address. You could have just called. I wanted to see you. She hesitated, then stepped aside. 5 minutes. The house looked smaller than I remembered, maybe because the light had changed, or because there was less laughter to fill it. He writes me letters from prison, she said suddenly. Miles. Says he's sorry. Says he was scared. Says you ruined his life. I didn't ruin it, I said. I revealed it. She looked at me for a long time. You sound proud of that. I'm not proud, I said softly. I'm consistent. Her jaw tightened. You always said family mattered more than anything. It does, I said. That's why I couldn't let him poison it. She shook her head. You didn't save it, Dad. You just burned it cleaner. Her words hung in the air like smoke. She didn't ask me to leave, but I knew the visit was over. Back home, I went to my workshop, the one place still untouched by betrayal. The floorboards creaked the same way they had before all this began. Beneath one of them still sat the fireproof box I'd hidden everything in: copies, notes, photographs, the false ledger pages that started the chain reaction. I lifted the lid. The papers stared back like ghosts. I could have burned them right then, should have. But part of me couldn't. Because without them, what was left of the man who'd spent a year chasing justice? I closed the box instead, sealed it with tape, and slid it back under the floor. Maybe some truths aren't meant to vanish. Maybe they're meant to stay buried, reminders of what it costs to even the score. Later that night, I stood on the porch again. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to mean safety. Now it just meant everyone else had learned to live without noise, without guilt. Across the way, Hannah's light flickered on. A shadow passed by the curtain, maybe her, maybe not. It didn't matter. The world had moved on. I raised my glass toward the empty air and whispered to no one in particular. Here's to balance. Then I drank. It didn't taste like victory. It tasted like arithmetic, exact, cold, endless. It's strange how quiet guilt can be. You expect thunder, but what you get is a drip, steady, soft, impossible to ignore. That's what my life became after Hannah's last words, a leaking faucet in the dark. Days turned into routines. I still mowed the lawn every Saturday, still took my morning walks, still waved to neighbors who now looked at me like a cautionary tale. They didn't know details, but gossip has a way of filling in blanks with accuracy cruel enough to feel like truth. Some whispered that I'd set up my son-in-law. Others said I'd done what needed doing. Either way, no one invited me to barbecues anymore. Justice had made me solitary. One evening, I got a letter from the prison. The envelope was thick, formal, printed with the state's seal. I almost threw it away. Then I saw the handwriting on the flap, Miles. Inside, the first page was scrawled uneven. He wrote like a man whose hands shook more than his conscience. You win. That's what you wanted, right? They'll never let me out. The deal's gone, Rendell's ghost still haunts me, and I keep hearing your name in my dreams. You should know something, though. You didn't just ruin me. You ruined her. She visits once a month, but she's not really there. She looks at me and sees you. And I think maybe that's your real punishment, living long enough to watch yourself become me. I read it twice, then again. Each word felt like a mirror held up to something I'd rather not see. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same drawer as Hannah's note. They belonged together, twin testimonies of what I'd won and what I'd lost. The next morning, I went to church for the first time in years. I didn't go for God, I went for quiet that wasn't mine. The pews smelled of old varnish and lilies. A few familiar faces turned when I entered, not with hostility, just cautious curiosity. The sermon was about forgiveness. I barely heard it. My mind wandered to the ledger, to Rendell, to Miles, to every man who ever thought he could buy peace with money or revenge. I realized then that forgiveness isn't something you give or receive. It's something that dies if you starve it long enough. Afterward, the pastor, a kind man with tired eyes, stopped me at the door. Haven't seen you in a while, Mr. Grayson, he said. You doing all right? I'm trying to balance a few things, I said. He smiled gently. You know, not everything in life adds up. I wanted to tell him that was exactly the problem. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was too full of ghosts. Every creak was a voice, every shadow a judgment. I poured a bourbon, sat at my desk, and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. I started writing. Not a letter, a confession. It wasn't for the police, or for Hannah, or even for Miles. It was for me. I wrote about the robbery, the ledger, the calculations, the traps, the way justice had felt clean in the planning but filthy in the aftermath. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the bourbon went warm and flat. I thought justice was order. But order without mercy is just arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't love you back. By dawn, I had 20 pages. I read them once, then sealed them in an envelope addressed simply, to Hannah, when I'm gone. In the following days, I began to set things in order. Closed my accounts, donated tools from the workshop, cleared the shelves of trophies that no longer meant anything. When Steele dropped by that week, I handed him the key to the floorboard safe. He frowned. What's this? Insurance, I said. If anything happens to me, I want Hannah to have the truth, all of it. The real ledger, the recordings, even Miles's letters. You planning on something? I shook my head. Just making peace with my math. He didn't press further. He was too old for speeches and I was too tired for lies. A few evenings later, I took one last drive out by the quarry, the place where Rendell's bones had been found. The sun was low, gold slicing through the dust. I parked near the fence and listened to the wind move through the grass. It was quiet, but not the empty kind. More like the world had finally exhaled. I realized then that revenge had never been about Miles or Rendell. It had been about me, about control in a world that keeps taking things without asking. I wanted to prove I could make the numbers align. But I'd forgotten that life isn't an equation. It's a debt that never really clears. I stood there until the sky turned violet, then drove home slow, the kind of slow you use when you're not rushing anywhere anymore. That night, I placed the confession beside Hannah's note and Miles's letter. 3 voices, 3 versions of the same truth. I turned off the lights and whispered into the dark. "I'm sorry." No one answered. But for the first time, the silence felt like listening, not punishment. Morning came thin and gray, the kind of light that doesn't promise much. It had rained overnight, and the world outside smelled clean, a cruel irony, considering the dirt I'd spent a year uncovering. The air was sharp, the sort of cold that reminds you your body is still obeying time even when your heart has stopped keeping track. I made coffee. No bourbon, not today. The cup steamed in my hand as I walked through the house one last time, touching things that once mattered: the photo of Hannah at graduation, the dent in the hallway where her bike crashed years ago, the patch of wallpaper I could never match after the flood. Ghosts, all of them, but polite ones. It struck me how small a life really is, a handful of rooms and a history of intentions. You spend decades building it, only to realize it fits neatly into a single story someone else will one day misremember. Around noon, Steele stopped by. He didn't knock, he never does anymore. "You missed our check-in," he said, though his tone was half concern, half habit. He looked around the half-empty living room, boxes stacked by the wall. "You moving?" "Tidying," I said. "Can't leave chaos for whoever comes next." He watched me for a long moment. "You ever think of forgiving yourself?" "For what?" "For being human." I smiled faintly. "That's the one thing I never wanted to be." He sighed, slipped a small envelope onto the table. "Hannah sent this through me. Said she wasn't ready to see you yet." When he left, I sat down and opened it. Inside was a single photograph, her as a child, me holding her up on my shoulders at a fair. On the back, in careful handwriting, she'd written, "I understand now. But I still wish you hadn't." That was all. No apology, no anger, just truth, clean and simple, the way I used to think justice was. That evening, I went to the workshop. The boards creaked as if greeting me one last time. I pried open the floor and took out the box. Inside were all the pieces of the story: ledgers, forged pages, recordings, statements, letters. Evidence of a life spent chasing the illusion of control. I set the box on the workbench and poured lighter fluid over it. The smell was acrid, sharp, alive. I struck a match and held it over the edge, watching the flame tremble like a nervous thought. For a moment, I hesitated. Every number, every note in that box represented certainty. But certainty had cost me too much. I dropped the match. The fire caught quickly, curling the pages into black lace. Heat rolled up my arms, hot but not painful, almost cleansing. The recordings hissed, the plastic warped, the ledgers shriveled into unrecognizable shapes. I stood there until the flames died to orange memory, until smoke filled the rafters and the smell of ash settled into my clothes. When it was done, I locked the door behind me and stepped outside. The sky was clear now, the stars sharp as cut glass. I walked down to the road where the streetlight flickered, the same one that had watched Miles drive away the night everything began. For the first time in months, I felt no need to look over my shoulder. The math was finished. Not balanced, just ended. I thought of something my father once told me when I was a boy: justice is like pruning a tree. You cut the branches so it grows straight, but sometimes you forget that trees remember the cuts. I finally understood what he meant. The next morning, I left a letter for Steele and another for Hannah. Hers was simple. There are things in life that can't be undone, but they can be laid to rest. I hope, in time, you can bury this too. Love, Dad. I placed it under her photograph and left the house unlocked. There was nothing left worth stealing. Then I walked to the hill overlooking town, the same place I used to take Hannah when she was little to watch fireworks. The air smelled of damp grass and faint smoke from last night's fire. The sun broke the horizon, slicing through the clouds like a blade made of forgiveness. I closed my eyes and let it hit my face. For a heartbeat, I felt weightless. Not happy. Not redeemed. Just finished. And that was enough. If this story spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can continue the journey by clicking the box on the left. Thank you for being here.